Okay. All right, we'll kick off then. All right, welcome everyone to the first webinar on Australian government requirements, and this workshop this webinar and the other webinars, 4 in total, are sponsored by the Queensland Government, Department of Science, and the Land Restoration Team, who are a key part of assisting in supporting these webinars. So these webinars are to do with a larger project to do with carbon farming and knowledge brokers. So we're trying to increase the knowledge brokers out there, and so the series of workshops, this is part of a series of 4, and it will provide tools and information for knowledge brokers of the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland and more broadly carbon farming. The content of these webinars is being shaped by representatives of NRM bodies in Queensland, Queensland water and land carers, and key producer groups, industry groups, and as I said, once more, the webinars are sponsored by the Queensland Government. Okay, but before that, I'd firstly like to give an acknowledgement of country, and so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting and webinar. I also acknowledge the contributions of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians to the inclusion and empowerment of all people in the country we live and share together. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Queensland. So I'll jump straight into housekeeping. I'm on schedule, so that's perfect. So in terms of housekeeping, so mute, so please stay on the mute, but you may like to use either thumbs up or clapping, smiley images that you have access to, so that could be useful. The chat box, please type any questions in the chat box that you would like addressed today. If we run out of time, they can be addressed in the reference material to be sent out following the webinar. The recording, so this webinar will be recorded and available on the QFF in NRM Regions Queensland website, hopefully just after Easter, but probably before. So the recording of the webinar may be freely shared, so you're aware of that. And this webinar is focused on upskilling those working with landholders involved in carbon farming. Video cameras, you can start with them on, but switch off if your line isn't good. And the format we've got today is, so Karen Graham from the Clean Energy Regulator will speak for around half an hour, and then we'll use the remaining time for questions. I also will just jump back to introductions. Welcome Chris Norman from NRM Regions Queensland, Louise Gavin from Remarkable NRM, who's facilitating these webinars, and Karen Graham from the Clean Energy Regulator. And thank you, Karen. We appreciate the time that you're making available today. And we've got quite a keen audience on here, and because this is being recorded, it will go further than just the people listening today. So thank you again. So I'll start off by just introducing Karen. So Karen's the manager of the Savannah Agriculture and Soil Projects team at the Clean Energy Regulator. She's been involved with the ERF on and off for over 7 years in a policy coordination and education capacity, and is looking after the team that administers the legislation and assesses registration and crediting applications for the methods related to soil carbon, savanna burning, and beef herd management. So welcome, Karen, and I will flick to you if you're happy and ready to present. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Nice to be here and be part of this webinar. I just, I've got a few things to try and cover in the short time we've got, and just wanted to say I won't necessarily know all of the answers to questions, particularly if we start to go into specifics on different methods, but very, very happy to take questions away and make sure that we've got answers in the reference material that Adam mentioned that can come out afterwards. The things that Louise asked me to come along and talk to you about were really some of the key messages that are really important to get across to somebody who is considering participating in the ERF. So we'll do that. I'll have a really quick overview of the ERF. I recognise that a lot of the people attending and watching this webinar probably already have a basic understanding of how the ERF works, so I won't spend too much time on that. A little bit of a snapshot of what's happening in the market for Australian carbon credit units in Queensland. I've been specifically asked to give you 4 things to get across to landholders and 4 things for landholders to monitor, or for projects to ensure that they're monitoring as part of their ERF project. And then I'm also happy to give a quick overview of what's happening in the method development space, because as people would know, the Clean Energy Regulator took over the method development function from the Department of Industry, Science and Energy and Resources late last year. So we're now up and running with that particular function. So happy to give you an overview of that as well. So I might just share my screen and switch over to my presentation now. Okay, so we all talk about carbon farming, and you know, as people know, carbon farming, it's a set of activities in the land sector that store carbon or avoid or reduce carbon emissions. So the LRF in particular recognises, and we definitely recognise, that there's a whole lot of benefits to undertaking many of these activities that can include improvements to productivity of herd or to soil. It can include improved drought resilience. It can enhance soil health and water retention, can have benefits for local ecosystems and benefits for communities. And that's what the LRF is recognising through its payments for co-benefits. So in addition to all of these co-benefits that people get from undertaking these activities, they can also look at diversifying their revenue stream by participating in the ERF and earning Australian carbon credits units. And they do that by registering a project under the ERF. So the ERF is a voluntary scheme, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that this is something that people sign up for, and it provides incentives for a range of organisations and individuals to adapt new practices and technologies. It goes far beyond farming. So there are also ERF methods and participants involved in waste management and energy efficiency and industrial facilities. So the ERF itself actually goes well beyond carbon farming. But, you know, today we're really focused on those ERF activities that can be included under the Land Restoration Fund as well. So by participating in the ERF, as I just said, you earn Australian carbon credit units. And one ACCU essentially represents 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent that's been avoided or stored, permanently stored and taken out of the atmosphere. Really importantly, ACCUs are a tradable financial product. So this is what people earn when they participate in the ERF. It's not like a grant. It's not the government giving them money to do something. They are actually earning a credit which represents their activity to store or avoid carbon dioxide equivalent. So they're a tradable product. They're fully fungible, which means that one ACCU, regardless of its source, can be traded either to secondary market players, can be sold to the Australian government, or it can be used in schemes such as the LRF. And we're seeing the market for Australian carbon credits grow. It's an increased trend in demand. The Australian government purchases ACCUs under the Emissions Reduction Fund through a reverse auction process. We usually hold about 2 a year. and that continues to be significant. We've got over $2.4 billion worth of contracts to deliver ACCUs at the moment. But what we're doing is we're seeing this shift from the Australian government necessarily being the largest purchaser of Australian carbon credit units to a lot more activity in the demand side market. And that includes state governments. So the LRF is a front running example of that, where the LRF has used the ACCU framework and the ARF framework to also drive a number of additional environmental and community and social benefits that it's wanting to see. And we're seeing the private sector. There's an increasing demand for offsets and good quality offsets. So Qantas, for example, aims to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So they'll be looking at efficiencies in their own operations, but they'll also be looking for offset opportunities. And the ACCU at the moment is a pretty premium investment grade carbon credit. So we're only seeing demand go up, and there's a number of different sources of demand. So a person who's earning ACCUs through the Emissions Reduction Fund, once they earn their ACCUs, they have a number of choices. If they've entered into a contract with the Queensland Government, of course, they're selling them to the Queensland Government. But if they're operating outside of the LRF, they can also sell to the Australian Government and to private sector through the secondary market. At the last auction, the average contract price was around $15.74 per ACCU. So that's where the last auction price was. Private sector trades are going for a little bit more at the moment. So these are probably possibly just a little bit out of date, some of these stats. So in Queensland, we've got a really strong performance. We've got 277 registered projects. Overall, in the ARF, we've got 903 registered projects. And the Australian carbon credit units, the ACCUs that have been issued so far, are over 86 million ACCUs. So that's representing 86 million tonnes of avoided or sequestered carbon dioxide equivalent. And Queensland's doing pretty well, as you can see. The bulk of this is just to show you what the bulk of the types of projects that are currently registered in Queensland. We've got a lot of savanna burning activity in the far north, and vegetation is definitely the second most popular, and we're starting to see some soil projects come through as well. In early December, there were 166 vegetation projects who have already earned 12.3 million ACCUs. So those are actual ACCUs that have been delivered. We had 31 agricultural projects registered, and those have earned more than 460,000 ACCUs so far. And we've got 39 savanna burning projects registered in Queensland that have been issued more than 2.5 million ACCUs to date. So this is a really simplified, oh, can you guys see that? Oops. I think that's kind of cut off in part. I might just ignore the graphic for a moment. Essentially, it's showing a simple diagram of the overall process. So that involves registering the project. Once the project is approved or declared, you follow the method, undertake the project. You provide reports and audits as scheduled and submit those for assessment. Once they're verified and assessed, then you receive the ACCUs. It's a very simplified version. The sorts of activities that are undertaken in the ERF on a very broad scale include protecting existing forest rather than clearing it, or it might be letting native forests regrow where they've been suppressed for many years, planting new trees. It could be changing farming practice to store more carbon in the soil, changing fertiliser practice to avoid runoff, changing the way you manage livestock and effluent, and also conducting early dry season burning, which reduces the emissions from late dry season wildfires in savanna areas. So we're now really getting on to some of the important things to note. So there are some really important eligibility criteria that people need to be aware of when they're considering participation. So the first one is that projects have to be new. It'll only allow projects that are new and additional. That means if if your project, it's clear that the project would have happened without the incentive provided through the ERF, or you've actually already begun the project activity, it's not likely to meet the eligibility considerations. The second one is legal right. So the project proponent or the person running the project has to have the legal right to undertake the activity and claim the credits from it in order to register a project. You also need to have, in addition, so that's the legal right to undertake the project, but it also needs to be legally undertaken. So you also have to have any permits required to actually undertake that particular activity. So a good example is with savanna burning, you need to have the required fire permits in place each year. The third is consent, and this is slightly different to legal right. If a project involves the sequestration of carbon, you actually have to get, or it's a savanna burning project, you have to get consent of all parties that have a legal interest in the land on which the project's being carried out. So those people are called eligible interest holders, and it can include anyone who's listed on the land title as having an interest in the property. So for example, the bank that holds a mortgage over the land. And the reason is that because the reason for that is because if you undertake a sequestration or a land-based project, there are implications for how the land can be used. And so anyone else who has an interest in the land actually has to give you permission.
Karen, can I ask you a question that's on
Sure.
our chat?
Yep.
So earlier on when you had the big map, and so I'm
Yep.
just thinking about it in relation to what you've just said, there's quite a difference between the states in the sorts of projects or the amount of projects. So
Yep.
yeah, why the dramatic difference in the states? Yep, there.
Yep, this one.
Yep.
Look, I think probably the opportunities potentially that are related to the different methods. So for example, savanna burning projects can only occur in particular areas, in areas that have savanna. So the northern part of Australia is going to have an advantage there. Most of those NT projects that you see, for example, would be savanna projects. In terms of the various vegetation methods, there'll be certain areas that have better potential to earn credits than others. Sometimes it can just be that you actually get a number of successful projects happening in an area, and then it fosters new activity. There's quite a lot of landfill gas projects, I believe, in New South Wales and Vic. So they're probably bumping up the numbers there as well. But it can be a range of reasons. Yeah.
Yep, thanks.
Yep. So the last important eligibility consideration was just that you can't register a project to do an activity that's already required by another law. So that comes back to the project actually being an additional activity. So we're going through quite quickly, so I think we're going to have lots of time for questions, which is really good. So in terms of the top messages that are important to get across to somebody who's participating, I'll just sort of run through. I've got them up here, but the first one I think is really making sure people understand that the ACCUs that you earn from running an ERF project are a tradable financial product. As I said, one ACCU equals 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, regardless of the source. And for that reason, it has a very robust framework behind it. It's not the same as, let's say, a government mechanism like a grant, where you can sort of be a bit discretionary and you can have differences between projects. If someone buys an ACCU, and that could be third or fourth hand that they're actually buying or trading an ACCU, they have to have assurance of its credibility and that it does actually represent that 1 tonne. And this is why there are methods which set out the rules for what you can do. And those methods are quite prescriptive in terms of what you can do, how it can and can't be done, and how you measure and model and calculate abatement. It's also why audits are required. They're a very big part of the verification framework, and to verify that the ACCUs claimed are credible. So it's just something that you might come across in people sort of saying, well, why is this so complex? You know, last time I got a grant for this, I just had to put in an application and then provide a report, and I was able to get the money. This is a very different proposition. You're actually volunteering to participate in a carbon market, and what you're earning is a tradable financial product. So it's just a really important contextual thing, I think, and it will help people understand why there is the complexity that there is.
So Karen, you mentioned the word audit.
Yep.
How do people do their audit? Are people going to expect NRM support staff to help them, or is this just through?
So audits have to be undertaken by a registered greenhouse auditor. So there's actually a register on our website. When your projects are declared or registered under the ERF, you will get an audit schedule that will tell you which reports have to have audits come along with them. And because you have to use a registered auditor, it's a really good idea to get started early in terms of selecting that auditor and essentially booking them in. Right. The audits are also relatively expensive. There's no getting away from that. Yeah, it's a minimum of 3 at the moment, and every initial report, so every project's first report, will have to have an audit come along with it. Yeah. It is the framework's being looked at the moment. There was some a consultation paper released late last year. So they are looking at that audit framework and how it might be able to be adjusted so that it's a little bit less of a burden, especially for smaller projects. But so yeah, at the moment, expensive.
Do you mean 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20?
It depends on the size of the project and the method partly, but you know, so yeah, it can vary it's pretty hard to give a figure, but it will be in the thousands.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, that's probably the first message, is just that context that this is what you're signing up for by participating in the ERF. The second is that it should be treated like a business decision. So like any business decision that a farmer makes on their property, it's going to have long-term implications for what they can do on their property, particularly if it's a sequestration project. And just like planting a different crop or trying a new breed of stock, they really do need to understand the opportunity and the costs. So the costs of participating might include things like, you know, getting legal fees and advice. And I know that LRF actually helps out with a bit of that, but it's also, it could include measurement costs. For example, if you're undertaking a soil carbon project, you actually need to get the soil sampled at several points, and then there's the cost of the activity itself. But of course, there's the other side of that ledger is the benefits. And you know, in looking at the benefits, it's not just about the return from the sale of the ACCUs. It's also actually about the other things that activity brings. So coming back to that previous slide, for example, if you're increasing your soil carbon as a result of this project, you're also more than likely increasing the productivity of your soil. So yeah, it's important that it's seen as a business decision and weighed up in that way, and that people get advice where they're unsure, and do make sure that they've kind of done a bit of due diligence in terms of what's involved. The third point is that if you decide to participate, you have to be committed to, and it's a sequestration related project, you have to be committed to protecting and maintaining the stored carbon for the permanence period. So all vegetation and soil carbon projects have permanence obligations, and this is because in order to be credible, the carbon that they're paid for has to stay out of the atmosphere for the permanence period that's been chosen, and they can choose 25 years or 100 years to do that. So there is an obligation that actually comes with that one. As soon as you've been credited, essentially you can't do things that disturb that carbon, and we'll see it released back into the atmosphere for whatever permanence period you've chosen. So it's really important that they understand that. It's important that they know that they'll have to provide a plan regarding what reasonable actions they'll undertake to protect that stored carbon. In soil projects, that's covered in the land management strategy that they have to provide, but in vegetation projects, it's provided separately as part of registration and also needs to be included in your reports after year 8 and year 24. There's coverage in the scheme for natural disasters, so that's important for people to understand. So as long as you can show that you've taken, so if you do, for example, a vegetation-based project, the expectation is that you will have put in place a plan to try and protect that vegetation using reasonable activities, so fire breaks or whatever else, to try and protect it from, let's say, bushfire. If you've done those reasonable things and a bushfire comes through, we're not going to come and say you have to give us back all the credits. There'd be a negotiation then, and the expectation is that it's managed so that that carbon can recover and get back up to the point at which you've been credited. So there is definitely coverage there for natural disasters, as long as you can show that you were responsible and you undertook some reasonable activities to try and protect it. If a farmer decides to do something different with their land, which disturbs that carbon and re-releases it, and they've been credited, they have to pay the credits back. So they need to understand that if you're undertaking a sequestration project and you're credited, that credit brings with it an obligation to keep that carbon stored for the permanence period. And the fourth point, and this is, it's a tricky one, is people really need to have a look at the method. There's 3 pieces of legislation that every project is governed by. There's the Act, the Carbon Credits Act, there's the Carbon Credits Rule, and then there's the method. And there might also be some supplementary documentation like mapping guidelines and soil sampling supplements and things like that that are related to the method. The Act and the Rule have more generic requirements, and most of those will tend to be in our forms, so you'll be prompted to provide that information. The method is really the king. It sets out who and what is eligible, what information you need to provide about your project at various points, how you have to conduct the activity, how you calculate the abatement, what records you need to keep, what you need to monitor, what you need to notify us of. It's really the rule book for the project, and anyone who's running a project, so as opposed to actually signing over the right for somebody else to run the project on your property, if you're taking it on as the participant or the proponent, you've actually got to read that method and understand what's in it. There are some simple method guides around for some methods, and there's other guidance on our website. It's a really good idea to read as much as you can, and again, to get advice and assistance where you're struggling. So that's where a carbon service provider can actually take some of that complexity and, you know, enter into an agreement with the land owner so that they're undertaking the activity, and the carbon service provider is actually looking after all of the various complexities that they need to make sure that they're meeting in order to be eligible for ACCUs.
I have a question before you go to your next slide, Karen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in our chat box, I've got, can you describe the payback process for the sequestration methodology? So is it annual? Just when you were saying, if they, yeah.
So the way that it works is you are paid on abatement, essentially. People have the option to, in a sequestration project, they can report, the maximum reporting period is 5 years. So if they want to, they can choose to just report every 5 years. So it's the report which actually then will set out and establish how much CO2e you've stored, and that's how many, then you'll get issued ACCUs in accordance with that. So it depends on when you report, essentially. So participants can choose how often they report. They can choose every 6 monthly if they want to do that. Soil carbon sequestration is a little bit different. There's a number of timing considerations in that, which mean you probably wouldn't be looking at reporting as often, because you do have to measure each time you report. So yeah, you're paid once you actually demonstrate the abatement through the reporting. You're given the credits, sorry. You're not paid, you're given the credits. You issue the credits. The Land Restoration Fund, if it's a Land Restoration Fund contract, the Land Restoration Fund would then pay you, I imagine, on transfer of those credits. Does that answer the question?
It did from my end, but I didn't ask it, so I hope.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. Yep. Alex has said yes. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yep, no worries. All right. So moving on to the other thing I was asked to have a look at was the top 4 things to monitor. So this is just repeating what I was just saying in terms of knowing the requirements of the method. So every method will have a section on record keeping, notification and monitoring requirements. So it's really important that people understand what's in their particular method. I think that timing considerations are really important. And again, every method is different. But actually having a really good plan that brings in place the different timing requirements, to me, would be a smart way to set up and run your project. So you need to understand the minimum and maximum reporting periods, which I just touched on. So generally the minimum is 6 months, with a maximum of 2 years for savanna burning and 5 years for vegetation and soil sequestration based projects. If it's a very large project that earns over 2,000 tonnes a year, it can actually report as frequently as monthly if it wants to do that. So it's a really good idea to keep in mind which reports need to be accompanied by audits as well. So we touched on this before. So have a plan for when you're going to report, know which of those reports will need an audit, get started early on engaging an auditor. I think another really important thing is with regeneration projects, there are checkpoints within those methods, and there's a forest cover assessment date, which it's good to keep in mind, and that's the date by which 90% of the area that's in a carbon estimation area has to have actually reached forest cover, or else certain sort of things happen. So knowing when those regen checks and forest cover assessment dates are is really important for regen projects. So they're the HIR and NFMR projects. In soil in particular, understanding how soon.
Karen, you just said NFMR. You just said a lot of words there.
NFMR is native forest managed regrowth. Actually, I don't know if that one is an eligible one in the LRF. Might be worth having a look. And HIR is human induced regeneration. So they're two different methods. Yeah. Thanks. Soil carbon has particular timing implications around when you can, how soon. So once you register your soil carbon project, you undertake your baseline sampling, and then there's certain restrictions on how long you have to wait till you do your next sampling round. There's also certain restrictions on, for example, if you add particular types of fertilizer, you can't actually sample within a certain window. So again, knowing what's in the method in terms of what you can and can't do and restrictions on the activity is really important. So timing constraints are one of those things that I think the more people can understand those and actually plan those out right up front, the less likely they're going to be to get into problems. And importantly, those maximum reporting periods, even if you haven't actually earned any credits, so you haven't actually sequestered any carbon, you still need to provide a report to meet those maximum reporting periods. You can't just let it go till it looks good for you. You have to actually submit something. You don't have to claim credits with every report. That's probably an important little thing to note. So you can report and not actually put in a claim for credits, which is referred to as a certificate of entitlement application. What's next? So records. Similarly, I think setting up a record keeping system to make sure that records are being kept along the way is probably really good management practice. So the method, as I've already said, will set out particular records that need to be kept, and the earlier a system's set up to do that, the easier it's going to be. They're the sorts of things that the auditor will come and have a look at. It might include receipts or records of when specific actions were undertaken, or photos, or records of when particular tools were updated. So again, be familiar with what's expected under the method and then set up a system to capture those along the way rather than trying to scramble and have to do it before a report. And there are a number of changes to the project that actually the Act requires that you notify us of within, it's usually within 90 days. You have a 90-day window to let the CER know things have happened. So that can include things like reversals of stored carbon. So that might be if a fire has come through, then you need to notify us that that's happened and of how big the fire was and how much of your area has been affected, or disease or dieback. Those are the sorts of things that it's really important people reach out and tell us about. There's also the FPP stands for fit and proper person. So any person who is running a project must have a fit and proper person status. They go through a check when they first register. And there are certain events that can affect that status. Bankruptcy or criminal charges can actually affect that status, and there is a requirement that we're notified of those. But also if the project area changes, so if there's a decision that a certain area of the original project, they want to actually carve that out and do something else, then you need to actually then let us know and to vary the project, or if the property is sold. Or a new owner comes on to the title, then it's important that we're notified of those as well. So just being aware that there are certain things that require communication with the CER if you've got a project.
Karen, we do have a question still about, you just mentioned fire again. Mm-hmm. We have a question, can you speak more about natural disaster and bushfire in regards to sequestration method? And how would you describe a reasonable effort in preventing a fire? Because I suppose some of the areas north will have a fire every year. So So and that's something that you need to take into consideration in terms of making a decision about whether or not to run a particular type of project there. So if you do have an area that has a fire go through every year and you don't think you could reasonably prevent that, well, that's going to do a fair number on the amount of carbon you're able to sequester in that project. But coming back to the idea of a natural disaster, so essentially I think the Act, and we've got some good guidance on this on the web in terms of permanence obligations and fire, but the Act describes it as it's a reversal caused by something that could not have been reasonably prevented.
So that comes back to we're not prescriptive in what's reasonable. It would be about what's put forward in the plan. So you have to have that permanence plan in place that tells us what you will do to protect. So let's say there is an area that has a high risk of fire. Well, what will you do to protect that stand of trees or that set of vegetation? What are the activities you'll undertake? If a fire then goes through, then, you know, the first question we will be saying is, you know, what did you do? Provide us with the evidence of what you actually did do. And you know, the regulator's reasonable. If people had clearly undertaken activity to try and prevent it, but the fire was just too big and ugly a beast for that to actually have any effect, then we're going to be reasonable. So it's not prescriptive. It will be largely a case-by-case basis, but the important thing is you can't just lock it up and leave, have a bushfire go through and then expect that will be okay. There is an obligation to actually protect that credited carbon, or to try to protect it. Does that?
Yep, that sounds good. Thanks. I've got to let you keep talking. Sorry, I was looking at the time.
Yeah, no worries. Well, actually, that was pretty much it. Louise, I think you had some questions on method development and method priority. I've actually got a couple of slides, so I'm happy to sort of start to dip into them now, if you like.
Yeah, great, because there's a couple here. So talking about new methodologies coming up and how people can be involved.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
So, as I mentioned, the Clean Energy Regulator is now doing the method development function, which was previously done by the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. The Department of the methods are developed according to the priorities that the minister sets. So essentially the minister will set the priorities each year for the following year. So last year the minister set out that the ones up on the screen at the moment are the current method development priorities. So we've got new methods under development at the moment for soil carbon. So we're looking at a new method that's going to potentially use new soil carbon models and hopefully will reduce some of the cost of measurement that's there with the current soil carbon methods. Then carbon capture and storage is being looked at, biomethane is being looked at, plantation forestry. So that's a method that's going to build on the existing plantation forestry method, but it will offer a few more opportunities for plantation forestry. And then blue carbon, which is actually about the restoration of tidal flows and the mangrove habitat. So they're the ones that are currently being worked on. We've got super ambitious aim to develop methods within 12 months of commencing work on them. So our method development teams are working really, really hard. And the way that they're doing it is they're using co-design with industry, potential end users, scientists and technical experts, and also the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee. So that's the committee, that's an independent committee that will make the final recommendation on a method to the minister. And so we have to actually take them along with us as well as the methods developed. The CER and ERAC so all new methods are released for public consultation once they're at a point where it can be released for public consultation. So there's definitely going to be an opportunity for people to provide comment on those methods that are currently underway. We've got a method development tracker, which you can see on our website. And you can sort of see where each of the methods are currently up to. There's also some links on the website if you actually want to engage as well, or you'd like to find out more about them. So that's the spot to go. If you look up method development under the ERF on our website, then you can find out more about that as well. Later this year, probably in the early part of the year, the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources will probably put out a call for ideas on new methods. So they'll start that process of considering what will go into the prioritisation for next year. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that there will be that sort of call for ideas later this year. So yeah, that was me. That's what I have. So very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Wow. And great timing too. There is a question, I'm just going to scroll right back up because it was earlier on, about reef regulations type stuff. So I was just waiting to see if it did come up. So with reef regulations, oh, I've just lost my questions, being implemented. Now I've moved. I've got to find it now. With the reef regulations being implemented in Queensland in reef catchments, do you see this prohibitive to any future nutrient methodology take-up? So if other methods are developed to do with the nutrients in the Great Barrier Reef or that sort of thing. I wonder if you can help us on that one, Karen.
I don't know that I can answer that one. I would say any new method development will always have an investigation of other regulatory frameworks that sit around it. So I'm not sure if what the question's asking is if there's a regulatory framework that's already restricting certain activities, would we also have a method that encouraged people to stop those activities? Or, yeah, I'm not really sure I understand what the question's asking in terms of the ERF, but
Adam, did you want to add any more to that? You've probably got a bit more understanding.
Yeah, so I'm unmuted. Yeah, I guess my thoughts were obviously with the reef regulations and nutrients being regulated, I suppose, to a point, when you're looking at potentially there's a cotton methodology, I understand, that could be used or expanded, and I just wonder if that's looked at for cane or potentially horticulture.
Oh, okay.
But,
I see. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and whether that, because of the regulations and the certain standard there is now, additionality and so forth, and whether people could actually take it up, or if it would be. It was just a thought I had. I just wondered if it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's so definitely, if somebody was to register a cotton project at the moment with the irrigated cotton method that we have in place, then we would have to have a look at whether actually what they're suggesting their activity would be under that project is actually what they're required to do now under that new regulation. And if we found that it pretty much was, then they wouldn't be registered, because it wouldn't be additional. If they were going well and above, or doing something that kind of went well above whatever the regulatory standard was, and that's something that we can look at as well. So we do have situations where an organisation or an individual can show us that what they're planning on doing under the project is going well above what they would have done otherwise. And sometimes that can get a project through. And then I guess it depends a little bit on the calculations in that particular method, because you can't really be issued ACCUs, for example, for something that you would have done otherwise. But it depends a little bit on whether the activity is something slightly different and on top of what they're required to do. It's definitely worth us having a look at that legislation, though, to see, so that we're forearmed if we do get projects coming through, that they're not then getting paid credits for something they had to do anyway. That's the general principle. You don't get credits for something you had to do anyway. And then in terms of any new method, as I said, in terms of an expansion of that method, for example, if you're looking at sugar farming or whatever, then there would definitely be involvement of the state government, I imagine, in the development of any new method. And what we'd be looking for there is, well, what's the opportunity over and above the regulation that we could actually provide an incentive for through the ERF. Does that help? Yeah, I've got my video turned off because when I turn it on, the sound goes funny. So I'm going to have to stay incognito.
You can have lunch too. I do have a bit of a follow-up question for that about you defining new. So someone has asked regarding soil sequestration projects, what defines new? So if there's regen practices have been used for some time, would it only be considered new after, the baseline determined?
So with the soil method, there's a list of eligible activities. So the fact that someone's done regen activities on it already doesn't preclude them from participating, but they would have to show us that they're going to do something new or materially different as part of the project. So, you know, if they've been doing stock rotation to maintain soil carbon, and then the new activity is that they're going to add eligible organic fertilizer, then that's fine. They're actually showing us that they're doing something new and materially different. So as part of registration of that project, you actually have to provide a description of what you've been doing for the last 10 years. And then you have to select which one of the eligible activities is the new and materially different one. That doing that new and materially different activity doesn't mean you have to stop the other things. You can do many more things. You can do whatever else you've been doing in the past or would like to add on to increase your soil carbon, as long as it's not an activity that's actually restricted in the method. So there are certain things that are actually restricted in the method. So that's essentially how we would look at it. We would look at what you've been doing in the baseline. How is what you're going to do now materially different from what you were doing then?
So I know lots of people are trying different things in regenerative agriculture, and so some people will get in, have a go, see that it either will or won't work. Are they able to just step back to general run-of-the-mill practice, then go back into registering, and then work out that's going to be okay, because it's trialing something to see if it's going to work?
Look, my advice would be register before you start. Or if look for something different and new that you can do under the method. Because the baseline is 10 years, so you would have had to stop 10 years ago in order to bring that back in. So but there's no, the important thing to remember is, just because you choose a new activity that then makes the project eligible doesn't mean you have to stop all the other activities. You can continue doing those things, but you have to demonstrate that you're doing something different to what you've been doing within the last 10 years.
Thank you. And we are getting to a few minutes before, but I'll still ask another question that's here regarding the lifetime of a method. So, are they forever,
So methods are reviewed. They've got a regular review process, and they're not necessarily forever. So they're regularly reviewed. If at that point it was found, for example, that there was no uptake, for example, then they might actually consider pulling it. Or if the review found that there is a whole lot of problems with this method, and actually what we need to do is either do an amendment to the method or a new version of the method, then that all gets fed in. So they are regularly reviewed. That's actually part of the legislative framework, is that they do get looked at regularly.
Thank you. I'm wondering if anyone else has another question. We could squeeze one more in. But at the moment, Karen's very lucky. She has no specific extra homework. So you didn't ask anything too hard of her. So well done, everyone. Or well done, Karen, I actually should say.
I just saw that new one come in from Angus.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Oh, look, I don't know. I really can't. It's a government policy, right? So it's something that I really can't speculate on. I do know, as I mentioned before, that we're only seeing an increase in demand for good quality credits with integrity, and that is, you know, the flip side of the complexity and the rigor and the complicated methods of the ERF is that they have a lot of integrity behind them. They have to meet a set of offsets integrity standards. They're government backed essentially. So I think if you just look at what's happening at the moment in the market for ecosystem services and for carbon offsets, I can't imagine the carbon market is going anywhere soon, that's for sure. Hopefully that helps a bit, Angus. It's probably all I can comment on.
Yeah. Right, so I've probably got one more question if I've got time, Adam, do you reckon?
Yep, one more.
All right. So I wonder, where are some good resources to help small farmers learn about aggregation? So lots of the southern people are saying about needing to do aggregation type things. Lots of the coastal landholders are talking about their blocks are too small. Where can people start learning now? Because they're probably not into starting a carbon project right now, but being informed, where's a good place to start?
So there's a couple of things that could mean. So if what you're talking about is a number of small farmers coming together under one project, then there's certainly mechanisms within the framework for them to do that. They would have to work through things like legal right and whether who they're going to have as the nominated owner of the project. You can have multiple project proponents as well, and then they're all jointly and severally responsible for the project. It can get tricky doing it that way because then you've got to divvy up the ACCUs as well, you know, so it's sort of there's a lot of complexity in terms of the sharing arrangement. The other way they can do it is register. We don't have a limitation on how small your project can be. So you could register a number of smaller projects with each landholder being responsible, but actually share resources. So share, if you had, for example, an agent come in and help with the reporting and auditing and things like that, there might be cost savings there as well. So you could go either way. There's definitely, it's definitely possible for smaller farmers to get together and have a multi-proponent project, single project. They would need to get their own legal advice on the structure and the sharing and, you know, where the ACCUs go. So we wouldn't divvy up the ACCUs. It's sort of one set of ACCUs into one person or one party's account. So they would have to be thinking about what structure they're going to put in place to actually receive those ACCUs and then how they're going to distribute them. But it's certainly something that's possible. I don't believe we've got many examples of it at the moment. So I don't know if there's any sort of really ready-made materials for that sort of a scenario. It's certainly something I can take away and have a think of. But I think those issues of, how you would structure it, whether, for example, you would create a company, a small company, cooperative company or something like that, that then actually acted as the overarching proponent, or whether you would all just, all just go in together as jointly and severally responsible. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things that would have to be thought through. And that's where I guess getting that advice from an agent can help. The other alternative is that a project developer does it for you. So the project developer actually aggregates, they're given the right as proponent, and they aggregate a whole lot of small projects into one project. So that's another alternative as well. You could go to a project developer who does aggregation. There's pros and cons to both. There's pros and cons to just keeping it all separate and having a number of smaller projects, and versus actually combining them all into one big project. And that's something that people would have to have a look at. But it's something for us to think about if there's lots of interest in that, is what would be some resources that might help. And I imagine there's models that people like NRM might start to come up with that can help with that sort of a co-op approach to participation.
Well, I'm all good for questions, Adam.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Karen. That was fantastic. And for those that on the webinar, I hope you've gained something from that. I think there were some good questions asked, and Karen was lucky because she got to answer them all and didn't have to do any homework. So thank you again. And so that brings us to the conclusion of the first webinar. Just quickly, the second webinar is on the 11th of March, and that's to do with Queensland government opportunities. The third webinar is on the 25th of March, and that's Learn from a Carbon Farmer. And the final webinar on the 22nd of April is looking at critical resources and links. So there's a flyer that's circulating that will we can probably put a link up here potentially as we close this out. But yeah, they're the future webinars coming up. But again, I'd just like to say thanks again to everyone, and Karen especially, Louise also, and thanks Chris, and also John up there for some good questions. Okay, I think we'll sign out. Anything else to add, anyone?
Adam, I might just really quickly share my screen. I forgot, it's just got some contact details for the Clean Energy Regulator. So that inquiries is a general inquiries email. So if people have further questions, they can certainly send it through to that, or call the call centre and we can follow up.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. This is all recorded, so that's perfect. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.